Hello everyone, welcome back. Very good evening to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening based on the location you're watching this session. Welcome back to the session 3 of Java and Spring Boot project development for junior Java developers or for the new novice, or it could be anyone who want to know how the projects are built in Java and it's using its associated framework, which happens to be Spring Boot. Let me just reiterate, today happens to be the session 3 of this entire series. We already had 2 sessions. Session 1, we had discussed what we are going to achieve, what is the end goal and how we are going to approach some fundamentals we understood. In the last class also, in the session number 2, we had some more fundamentals. We could able to understand few more things, that how projects are built, and we had also started coding. We had also started writing the code, and we could able to develop one API also, and that was working fine. We have tested our API using the Postman tool. Fine. So anyone who is new to the world of Spring Boot or Java, or want to understand how the projects are built using Java, then this series will definitely help you. If you already have an experience in some other technology, some other stack, then that will be a plus. You'll just have to see what we have done in these stacks, what will happen in Java and Spring Boot. And also, if you are just a junior Java developer, or you may know only Java, you don't know Spring Boot, in that case also this entire series will help you. At the end, we are going to integrate the backend Spring Boot application with the front end React application, and we will also demonstrate how the integration of React and Spring Boot happens, and finally we will be able to build the one web application in the process of understanding how in the process of understanding both Java as well as the Spring Boot project development. Fine. So having said that, let's get started. Let's continue our journey from where we had stopped. Great. Now, just to reiterate, this entire series we will develop project using Java and Spring Boot. Of course, using the Spring Boot framework, and Spring Boot framework we are going to use Java programming language. Fine. So we will be developing project which we have already started, and today happens to be session 3. By chance, if someone is new to the today's class, still you may understand what we are trying to do here. It's good that you rewatch what we have already discussed in the last 2 sessions. That will definitely help you to go ahead with this. Fine. So this is what we are doing. In the last class, we also had the approach that we are going to follow a layered approach application development. We had discussed quickly. Let me summarize in 2 to 4 minutes of time what we have discussed in the last class. So we will be having a React application, which is our front end, the UI part, the presentation layer, what will be visible to the client. In the back end, we are going to use Spring Boot, and here we had discussed we will have multiple layers. And this happens to be the web layer, or you can call it as controller. Then we will have a business layer, or you can call it as service layer. And then we will have DAO, or persistence layer, whose responsibility is to deal with the database, to perform DB related operations, to store the data and to retrieve the data. Making sense? Now in your controller, we have to develop the logic which has the capability of communicating with any other application. For an instance, in our entire series, front end part, we are not using directly HTML, CSS or theme leaf or JSP. We have React application, a pre-developed application which we have already demonstrated in the last 2 classes. Today also I will just show you. And our React application we have here. So front end, whatever visible to the end user of our application, to the end users, it's a React application. Maybe there is a form, they will be entering some data. Whatever data my end user of our application is collecting, that data is taken by the React application. Right? So we will have the data in the React application, but in the database, to store the data, whatever we have collected from the end user, At the end of the day, we have to store the data in the database. For the backend part, to perform that activity, we have the Spring Boot application. Fine. And Spring Boot is Java based framework. So it is Java. Front end, it's a React. It's a library based on JavaScript. Fine. So backend application, we have, it's with a different stack, different programming language. Front end application we have, it is a React.js application which is based out of JavaScript. So we have two applications here basically, and at the end of that, it's one whole application. To develop that, we are using two different languages, two different technologies: JavaScript, React, Java, Spring Boot. Making sense? The syntax is different. The way those languages works is also totally different. Now, whatever React application, the data is collected from the end user, that has to be given to the Java application. Now, whatever syntax we have used here in the React application, which is based out of the JavaScript, that syntax you cannot use in the backend, as it is the same object, the same array, you cannot pass. It's a different technology. Fine. So we should have one default language which can be used to transfer the data between multiple languages. We have something called as JSON format. Fine. So using the JSON, the data has to be transferred between different applications in the JSON format only, because it is a universal format. That also in the last class we have understood. I'm just refreshing. I'm just trying to summarize quickly before we continue the today's discussion. Making sense? Now in here, in the React application, in the form, the data has been collected. That data in the form of JSON, React application has to keep it, and the JSON data by making a request to the API. What is API? Practically also we have seen in our application, in our controller layer, we should be writing the logic which should have a capability to receive this JSON data, and that JSON data, whatever I've received, that should be converted to normal Java object. And once it is a Java object, that I can pass to a different layer, service layer, from there the DAO layer, and store finally in the database. Whatever response is there, again it will give back from here. You have to give back the response in a way which this application also can understand. So now this JSON data which React application has, that means the form data, basically we have a form in front of you, the end user will enter some data. It is the React application which will collect the data, right? That data will convert into JSON format, so that the data can be given to some other application also, that can be understood by some other application also. Now the some other application might be there in different server. Through the HTTP protocol, it will make one request, HTTP request, and by making the request to the endpoint in the sense the logic, the API, whatever you have developed here, there the data will be transferred by making the request. Here we will receive the JSON data, will convert to Java object. Finally, by giving to the different layers, we are going to store in the database. Whatever response is there, we will give back the HTTP response. To give back the HTTP response, we have something called as response entity at the backend, which we will explore in today's class. This is the summary of what we had discussed in the last class. Also, we had started the API development, what exactly it is, what is endpoint, that thing also we have seen in the last session itself. Fine. So by keeping in mind that whoever were a part of this session for the directly in the third session might have gone through the first two sessions and they have some idea which we have already discussed, I would like to continue my journey here. Making sense? Now let me just show you this. This is the API which we have developed in the last class. You can see here we have developed an API which is mapped to the post HTTP request. That means the data will not travel from that React application to my Spring Boot backend application in the URL. Rather, it will travel in the HTTP body. If you want more on this, last class I had given the highlight. Still, if you want to know more, just try to learn on HTTP, different types of HTTP methods. That will help you. Now, my end user React application will reach to this endpoint. Here as you can see, API and student, and wherever this application is deployed, that server details this API and student, and will pass the JSON data, will make a request, HTTP request, will pass the JSON data. That JSON data I'm receiving here, convert into Java object. Once we have a Java object, as a Java developer, Spring Boot developer, you know how to work or how to play around with Java objects. We will see that also. This is what the development is. Fine. And also, okay, let me also show you the React application very quickly. These are the endpoints. I have told you this responsibility as a developer you have to deal. You are going to write a code for this. This is based on where your Spring Boot application is deployed, in which server. If it is deployed in the cloud, this address might change. If it is deployed in some other external server, this address might change. But whatever you specify, these are the actual endpoints to access that. So basically, my React application is collecting the data in the form of JSON, and that data, by making the request to this URL where it is deployed, the address of where my application has been kept deployed in which server. That address, since it is a local server, Spring Boot application embedded server, it is deployed there. And finally, this is the endpoints which I have created, and we have seen also in the last class. Making sense? So this was our development, and we could also able to get, we have tested our API using the Postman tool. Now we may have to proceed further in order to continue the discussion here. Is that fine, every one of you? Can we proceed ahead? If I just get some response. Wonderful. Now different APIs we have to develop. First is adding the student. That is done. Now we have to take care of the remaining things. Now before I also talk on this, whatever student object I have received here, that student object I want to pass to my service layer. In the service layer, I will make use of the logic which is there in the persistence layer, DAO layer, and store the data into the database. Now the best part is, which you will see in the upcoming classes also, the persistence layer is there. No, last class also I had talked about this DAO layer. As a Spring Boot developer, you need not to write logic. You just have to use some of the predefined methods which has already been coded by Java team, Spring Boot team. So you just have to make use of one module here called as Spring Data JPA. Spring Data JPA. Fine. But if you make use of this particular module within the Spring framework, your efforts are almost all the efforts which is required usually, that will be reduced. Only minimal things you have to do here. You need not to develop the logic only. You just have to create one interface. The implementation will be taken care by Spring Boot. Usually, interface concept we use to specify. We use interface in Java or Spring Boot, wherein we specify what need to be implemented. We usually give the specification, what need to be coded. And later we write the class which will implement this interface and give the implementation for whatever specification we have provided here. Now, if you go with the Spring Data JPA to store the data in the database, you just have to create the specification. Implementation for this at the runtime will be taken care by Spring Boot only. And whatever body is required, Spring Boot will give that. You just have to call the methods. Usually in normal classes, we write a method in a class in Java, then we call that method in any programming language in that matter. We just first define the function. Later we call that function. That's what we do, right? Same goes here also. But we need not to define here. Function definition, method definition, whatever is required, implementation will be given by Spring only. That part also we need not to worry. Now, I just have to take care of this business layer. Here I have to arrange something wherein whatever data we have received here, that data I will give it to service layer. In the service layer or business layer, whatever persistence logic is there, no, using that logic I will store the data in the database or retrieve the data, delete the data, update the data. All this logic is present in the persistence layer. That logic I am going to use in my service layer and perform the DB related operations. Now what is the next part here? I have received the data. This data student object right now I'm printing on my console. At the end of the day, I have to store in my database. So this object I will pass it to service layer, business layer. In the business layer, using the persistence logic, we are going to store the data into the database. Now that using the persistence logic is fine, But that persistence logic, as a developer, are you going to write, or Spring Boot team has already given to you? Spring Boot team has given to you. So already it's there. You just have to use it. Where are we going to use? In the business layer, in the service layer. Fine. Now let me just create the business layer. Okay. New one package I would like to create, Java package. Okay, let me just recreate it. New, it's a Java package. Package name I'll give it as maybe service. Okay, enter. We have a service layer now. Within this, I can have a class, but always it is recommended to code to interface always. Whenever you write a class, right, don't directly write the implementation. Recommended approach is code to interface. First, write an interface. What you're going to implement in the service layer. What is the business logic you're going to implement? First, you give the specification using the interface. Later, you provide the implementation in the class. There is one approach. Directly, you can create the class here. You can write the actual logic, business logic, whatever implementation or business logic you want to develop, you can do that. It's a recommended way is first create the interface. In Java, interface means providing way of providing the specification that what need to be implemented, what need to be coded. First give the requirement, then write the class which will implement that interface. Whatever requirements or specifications are available in the interface, that you have to implement using the class. So let me just create one interface here. Right click, and I would like to just create one interface. We have a Java class here. So here only we should have an option class package. That's fine. In the IntelliJ Docker, this is fine. Okay. Package interface option must be there here. Let me just again cross check. In the Eclipse and STS, which I have used very often, directly there is an option. Even otherwise, not an issue. It has to be the interface actually. New interface, there is an option here. Any option, not a problem. Let me go with the class. Okay, here only we have an option, sorry. Java class means it's a UI part of the, what do you say, IntelliJ. We have an option here. Second option is interface. The first option in the UI, they have given it as Java class directly. If I click, I am getting the option to create enum, annotation, class or interface. Wonderful. Let me just create the interface here. I'll give the name as I interface student service. Interface student. I'll give the name as service. Okay. Here I will provide my recommendation. What I am going to do here. That's my next part. What I need to implement. The first part which I want to implement here is to receive the student object from the controller, from the API. API has received the student object from the React application. After receiving the student object, that API will give me one student object. So I should write one method wherein that can receive a student object, return back the student object after storing into the database. That specification I have to provide here. Fine. So now I will write here one method. Public, the return type, the return type is student. I will say here save or register student, and here I'm going to provide maybe student type of data. Fine. So I'm going to import it. Done. I've provided the specification. So in my business class, the first requirement I have to fulfill is I have to make an arrangement. One method should be there which can receive a student object, which can give back the student object. So let me write one class here. The next part, new Java class, of course this time class, and I'll go with student service implementation. Okay. I hope whatever I've just told is clear. It's a good way. In this way, you can achieve something called as loose coupling. Fine. So now I would like to just write here logic. I mean, I have to implement that. So let me just write one keyword here. Implements one interface. Which interface? We have defined our own interface here, which is iStudent service. The moment you do this, it will ask you to override it. Implemented methods. Let me add this. We have got this. Now we may have to give the body. Fine. So now I am going to return the student object at right now. I'm going to return the student object. However, here I should be writing the logic to store the data in database. That logic I need not to write. I have to invoke the logic. Invoke. That means someone will write the persistence layer, a logic which can be, a logic which is responsible to store your student object into the database. So that we will write in the persistence layer. We will have multiple layers here, right? We have 3 layers here. So some logic will be present here which is responsible to store the data in the database. So in my service layer, what I have done is, from my API, I have received the student object. Some logic is written here. Using that logic, I am going to store the data in the database, and finally I'll return back the student object. Making sense? Now what to write the logic, we will see. This part is clear. Now let me go back to my API. In my API, first I will create one reference variable. I will create here private I student service. I will say here service. Using the interface type reference, and here I will say auto wire. Auto wire in the sense, I am asking my Spring Boot, look, for this interface, there is one implementing class. For this interface, there is one implementing class. Could you please inject that implementing class, this particular object, please add it here to this reference variable, so that using this reference variable you can invoke it. Fine now? So let me just save this. And I'll go back here. Again, I would like to save this. Automatically you'll get this option here. So let me just, okay, that should not be a problem. Is it okay? Let me just add a service layer here. No problem with my service layer. I just have to auto wire it. That means I'm telling I want my Spring Boot to inject the object which is implementing this interface. As simple as that. Fine. All right. My bad. I thought I am displaying that only, but anyway. Making sense? This is my specification of my business logic. This is my implementation of the business logic. Here we have to write the logic. And then fine. Now I hope now the screen is visible. There is no problem. Okay, great. My bad. I thought I'm not sharing the IntelliJ ID screen only. But anyway. So now I'm going to use a logic which is there in the persistence layer. That logic we will see later. Fine. I have done the arrangement in the business layer which can receive the student object, which can return the student object. In between, whatever logic will be available in the persistence layer, DAO layer, using that logic, this particular student object I am going to store in the database. That logic will be available in the persistence layer. Using that logic here, I will store the data into the database. That part we will see later. Fine. Now I'll come back to my API. In my API, here, I have to make use of, I have to invoke this method. I have to basically invoke this method. By calling this method, I have to pass one student object. That is what I have to do in my controller. So what I will do is, I will invoke this particular, method from my controller. In my controller, anyway, all of you know I am receiving the student object here. This student object, I have to pass it to business layer. Fine. So now I will say here, I will use one annotation that this is a business layer for which you just have to use something called as service. I will save this. Okay, service means I'm talking to Spring Boot that this is a business logic. This is a business layer or service layer. I'll go back to my controller. Now I will create interface type reference. Interface type reference. I'll say here private. I hope my screen is visible. Just kindly acknowledge. Private I student service type. Maybe I'll say here service. Okay. Now I'll ask Spring Boot for this interface, for this specification. I have given one implementation. Please inject that implementation here in this reference variable. That's the meaning of it. Fine now. Auto wire this. So there is one specification here in the business logic. In my service layer, actually I've implemented that method which is responsible to receive the data from the controller and store in the database. Now in my controller, I'm creating this reference variable parent type. And I'm asking my Spring, whatever object is there, no. Because I have told here, Spring, you take care of object creation here. You take care of object creation. The best part of the Spring Boot is you need not to worry of object creation and all of these things. You should just focus on the actual business part, actual business logic, the actual logic of the application. All this object creation part, dependency injection, everything will be taken care by Spring Boot. Now this object, I'm writing the class. Usually in Java, you know very well, we create the class and we are the one who is going to create the object of that class, right? Now I am creating the class here. Object who will create? Spring will create. Did I talk to Spring about the same? Yes. Using this interface, you have communicated to Spring. I have created the class. You create the object for this. Now here what I am telling to Spring, there is an interface. Fine. If you could remember business logic, I had told you to create the object of that. Spring will say, yes, I have created the object for this. I am telling, please add that object here. Please give the object address here. That means that object you please inject here. Now what I will do here is, I will say here, service dot save student. This method is there in the business layer, right? In the, what do you say, service layer. So what I will do is, this entire student object, I am going to give it to my business layer. Done. Now it is the responsibility of the business logic to receive and store in the database and response back the student object back. How to write this logic we will see. Finally in my controller I will get back some response. That response is student object only, which I will receive here. Student type may be st and the same response. Okay. Is it giving me student object? Let me just cross check here. Yes, it is giving me student object. Okay. Oh, I have done one more. Okay. No problem. Now let me just go back here. Done. Now I will return back the student object which I have received from the service layer. Done. Fine. I hope things are now clear. The control flow, at least whatever we have seen pictorially, how the data has to be transferred, that is clear. Fine. Yes. It is a live session only, Divya. It's a live session. Okay. Divya Arora, it's a live session, I guess. If you are asking, Jayant cannot see the screen. I have asked you, right? I hope now you are able to see the screen. No problem. Just confirm me once before I proceed further. Great. Let me show you back again. We have received the data here from our React application. Data is received here in my controller. After receiving in my API, I am passing the student object to my service layer. Service layer development is done. And from the service layer, by using the persistence logic, which we will show you in the next class, next two classes, we will be storing that into the database. We will, by using the persistence logic in my service layer, I will store that into the database. And finally, whatever happened, the student object will be responded back to the API. So this part, I hope it is clear. From here, the student object will be giving the response back to the React application. Fine, everyone. So that's all. And now we need to focus on the remaining API development. We need to focus on how do we develop the API which can, which can give the facility of retrieving the data, all the student objects whichever we have in the database, and giving the response back to the student, and which can also maybe take one ID from the API, from the React application, and just give the only student details if someone want to delete something to enable that facility. So all the controllers in the endpoints, the APIs, I have to take care now. The remaining, the entire control flow, I think we have seen the remaining service layer and the persistence layer, whatever I've shown, we have started the journey. The remaining development we will see in the upcoming classes. Now the next focus is to make more APIs so that the we can facilitate all the requirements of our front-end React application, which should give the facility, the API should have a capability to receive whatever request is coming from the React application and to give the response based on the request which we are receiving. That part we need to see after the break. And the remaining part, how do again we pass that to the service layer and use the DO persistence logic and store in the database, that we will see in the upcoming session. Now after the break, we will just see more on the REST API development part, which we have already started from the last class. Alright, now let's continue the discussion of the remaining API development. Later, we will see the remaining layers of the development. Fine. So let's continue here. So we have developed one API which is responsible to receive the student object from the React application and response back one student object itself. Now I have to develop one API one API which can, upon request coming from the React application, which can fetch all the records which are there in the database, all the students which we have in our Spring Boot application back to the React application. So how much ever student objects are there in the database, it could be 5, 10, 15, 20. So right now this API we should facilitate that code which is responsible to receive the request from the React application. After receiving the request from the React application, then what is the next? By making use of the different layers, fetch the data from the database, which is all the student records, and then all student records, whole student records, I have to give back to the React application. That API arrangement I have to do here. So maybe whatever the method name you want, you can give. I would like to go with maybe get all students. You can give any name. Okay. And all the students, not one student. If it was one student, I would have given the return type as student. However, it is not one student. It is many students. So we have a concept of collection in Java. By chance, if you know, collection means like an array. We can have large amount of data in one place. So right now, upon request coming to this endpoint which I am going to create from the React application, I should respond back with all the data. Not one student object, rather multiple student object I should give it. So the return type should be, I'll say a list, and within this we are going to have student. Fine, that is a return type. Fine. So let me just import this. I have imported from the Java utility class. Now what is the endpoint? I will go with maybe get request, and the API endpoint I will go with students. Now whoever will make the request for this endpoint from the React application, they will get how much ever students objects are there in the database. So here I should be writing the logic, invoke service method responsible to, okay, invoke the service method responsible to retrieve all records of student, all records of the students. Okay, all records of students. That in the service layer we have to do the development, that we will see later. And finally it has to return back. What we have to return back? Collection of student objects. We just have to return back the collection of the student objects. That's it. So what to return right now? We have nothing. So I would like to just return some collection. Maybe I'll say here new array list. Okay. My dear friends, right now it's an empty array list, nothing we have. Okay. I would like to go with maybe student objects. Let me just import this. Okay. Import this class. We have an option here. Done. Now we will call a method which is available in the business logic. We will ask him, look, I have got a request from the other application. They want all the student object, it seems. Service layer has developed that logic. I will call the service layer like the way I have done here. I have called the service layer and store the data, right? We have to develop the logic there in the service layer. From there, I will retrieve all the data. Whatever I receive, I will store in my collection. That collection I am going to return back. Remaining part we will see. The service layer, for this what to be developed here, we have to take care. We will see to it. Is this part? I hope it is clear. Now I have to also make a arrangement wherein student can pass the ID. Based on the ID, we have to return the student object. So in the React application, if you see, let me show you the React application. I have to open the React application. We have a edit student. We have a student list. You can see here. Upon hitting this endpoint, they will be getting all the student object. That student object they are displaying to the client, to the end user of our application. So React, the end user will just visit our website. They will be getting all the student objects. React application, the responsible for the UI part, the presentation part, they have done the arrangement. So they don't have the student object. The student objects are already there in the database. For the database, who is interacting? Spring Boot application. So if React application want all the student object, then they have to communicate with the Spring Boot application and they have to get all the students. To get all the students, they have to reach to this endpoint. Wherever Spring Boot application is deployed, that entire address, and these are the endpoints they have to reach. This endpoint will give them collection of student object. That collection of student object they will display to the end user. Fine. Now, again we have one more option wherein my React application seeking, by reaching to this endpoint, they will also pass one data ID. And I have to develop an API which can receive an ID from the React application. Based on the ID, I should respond back the student object. That API we have to develop here. Let's go here in our IntelliJ. Now let me develop an API. I will write the method as public. The response should be one student object, student object. Okay. And I'll say here find by ID or get. Okay. It has to be public. All right. I will say here get student by ID. Okay. It has to be binded. Of course, I have to return the student object only. I will say here new student. Now, like this we should not do. Here we have to invoke. Service layer method, which is responsible to retrieve the student object based on ID. Fine. So in the service layer, in the business layer, that logic will be available. We will invoke that method which is responsible to interact with the database, fetching the student object and returning back to this particular API. Right now, since we have not yet developed, I'm just going with the returning the student object. Now this has to be binded with the get request because they are searching, get mapping, and I would like to go with maybe the API endpoint is student. That's endpoint is student. Not just that, they're also passing the data here. We have something called as query parameter, path parameter. I don't want to get into that technical concept, of course. So now what I will be doing here is I will just have to make the arrangement. I will say here ID. Why ID? Whoever is reaching this endpoint, they will also pass one data ID. That ID I have to receive here. Let me just open my Pojo. What do we have here? So it is long type ID, integer type. Okay. We have not specified here ID because it is auto generated, I guess. Yeah, no problem. So don't we have ID here? Okay. Let me just add one ID also. Let me just create one ID for this. I'll say here private. Long type ID or integer type ID, doesn't matter. I will say here long type of ID. Done. For this, let me just generate the setters and getters. If you want, you can generate later also, or not an issue. Okay. So we have an option here to generate the setters and getters. I'll say generate setters and getters both for this ID. All right. Done. Now I would like to just go back to my controller. I will specify long type of ID or integer type of ID, whatever you want you can receive, that it's up to you. I will say integer type ID only. One annotation we have to use to whatever ID is there here. No, end user will reach to this endpoint, will pass the data ID number. That ID number I'm receiving here. That ID number I want to take it from here and I want to give it, for which I'm using something called as path variable. That means whatever this ID received from the React application, I want to inject here. Using that ID, I'm going to call the service methods, a business logic which we are yet to develop, and pass this ID. In the business logic, based on this ID, they will go to the database, they'll retrieve the student object. That student object will be returned back to the controller, and whatever student object we will receive here, that will return back to the caller of this endpoint. So remaining part we have to see. I'm just making the API arrangement ready. Fine. We will use either H2 database or PostgreSQL. We will see, because we have not yet developed the DAO layer. That part is in the next 2 sessions. Okay, we will finish the API development and we will see how much we can do with respect to the controller. Now I have to make one more arrangement. Maybe if someone want to delete some data based on the ID, for that also I have to make the arrangement. Let me just reuse this. I will receive here ID only, but it is mapped to delete mapping, and here I will say here delete student by ID, delete student by ID. Of course, I will not be returning the student object here. You need not to do. We have something called as response entity. In the sense, whenever we receive the HTTP request, right, in that request, 3 things might be there. URL, which is header, URL and the header and the request body. Like the same way, for the same HTTP request, we can respond back. The response could be body. Right now you can see here, I'm just giving the response body. In this API, if I'm retrieving the student, it's a response body. It is a response body. Only student objects are there. Multiple students are there. One student is there. You can also respond back with the status code also. Response header and response body. Both, if you want to give back to the end user, the caller of this API, then you can write here something called as response entity. Response entity. A precise response for the HTTP request. In that way you take it. Don't try to overthink. A precise response for the HTTP. Making sense? Fine? Okay. All right. Which DB? I think I have responded for this. Which DB we are going to use? Great. Maybe I'll say here student. So if you give like this, it's like more than the student object, not just the request body. You are also giving the other response back. Maybe HTTP status code also responding back to the client alongside the request body. Now we'll say here, either you can say new response entity, and let me repeat, if you don't know Java or Spring Boot, don't try to understand the syntax. Anyway you can understand, just to see the approach, how the API development is happening. Exact syntax, what each line will do, as you explore more, by default you will understand. You need not to worry much on that. Okay, so I'm just going to give one student object here, and maybe empty student object, and also I'll say a status code, HTTP status code dot OK. Okay, I will say a dot, and we have many methods here, many enums we have. What is enum? Again, you need not worry on that. Okay. Instead of this, we can also return in a better way. Same code can also be written in this way. I will say here return response entity dot OK. Fine now. But however, this time user will pass the student ID, will pass some ID. Based on that, the data has to be deleted. I should not give the response back with the student object only. So rather I will just say here response entity dot no content, nothing I want to give. Okay, dot I will just say here build. Now don't worry about this syntax, you will understand once we complete this entire API development. So I am just making the facility available here, wherein my end user, other application, by reaching to this endpoint, they can pass the data or they can pass the ID. Whatever ID my end user will pass, I should be responsible to develop a logic that based on the ID, the data has to be deleted. Now in the API development part, you should not take care of writing the logic to connect to the database and based on the ID to delete the data. All of that you should not do. Here you just have to make the arrangement to receive the HTTP request from the client. The client could be anything. It could be some other application. It could be direct end user, whoever it is. To receive the request, it should have a capability to receive the request. And based on the request, we have to process the request and response back. Now to process the request, you can make use of some other layers help. And right now, as we have discussed already in the last class, last class, in the today's session also, we are going to make use of service layer. So this ID, we will pass it to the service layer. And from the service layer, we will use the persistence logic and perform the required operation. Now, right now API development means I have given the facility which is required to take the request from the client, from the React application which we have seen, and also to response back appropriate. So that arrangement we have done here. Fine now? Now can we proceed ahead if you just respond in the chat? Little bit of service layer logic. Quickly. Now let's fulfill this. We have anyway implemented this service layer, so we could able to call. Now I have to cater this. Let me cater this API requirement. The API requirement is this API will receive request from the React application. React application will reach to this endpoint. End user, if they want to know or if they want to retrieve all the student objects which are there in the database. In the React application, you have done the logic. You have developed the UI logic which is responsible for that. And React application to cater that facility to my end user will reach to this endpoint. And I have developed the API to take that request and also to respond back to the client with all the student objects. Now, who is responsible to go to the database and retrieve all the data? Persistence logic. And persistence logic, where are you going to use? In the service layer. In the service layer, I have to make the arrangement like the way I have done here. So let me just go back here and provide the specification. What else I want to do in the service layer? I want to write a logic which can return collection of student objects. Get all students. Collection of student objects. Okay. Collection of student objects. This facility I have to do it. Let me just import this. Okay. Done. I'll go back to my service layer. And here I have to give the requirement for this. I have to import also. Okay. Done. Now here I have to, what I have to do here? I have to use the persistence logic which is responsible to retrieve all the data from the database. So that methods will already there. That methods we just have to invoke. So invoke a logic, persistence logic to retrieve all student records from the database. Okay. And finally, whatever it will give you the collection of records. That collection of records I'm returning back to the caller of this. Maybe I'll say here new array list. A collection I will receive from a database. So I'll just say here student, a collection of student objects. Okay. So here persistence logic is there already. I will use that logic and retrieve all the records from the database and return back to the caller of this method. Return back to the caller of this particular method. Now let me go back to my controller. In the service layer, I do have that logic available. So what I need to do here is I should be just calling that logic here, service dot, you can see get all students. This get all students will give me a collection. It will give me one collection. So let me just receive that collection here. I will say here list of student objects. It will give me. Maybe I'll say here list. Whatever list I am going to receive. That list I'm just going to return. So I'll say here return. What to return? Whatever collection of student objects I have received from the service layer, that collection of student object I want to return back to the caller of this endpoint. Now this API development and how I am linking this to the service layer, business layer logic, I hope you could able to understand. Now of course in the business layer I should make use of persistence logic. That persistence logic, as I've told, if you go with the Spring Data JPA part, you need not to worry much. So we just have to invoke some of the methods, and if we just call that method, it will give all the student objects I will store in my collection. That collection I will return to the caller of this method. And who is calling this method? In my API, I'm calling that method. So I will receive all these student objects. That student objects I will return back to the caller of this endpoint. That means to the React application. And in the React application, I am going to render that entire student object to the end user. All the student objects I'm just going to render. Is it making sense? I hope you could able to understand the entire control flow, at least these two things. Fine. Same thing, I also write the business logic for this to cater this API, also to cater this API. That we will see in the upcoming classes. So this is how in the backend, by following the layered approach, we go for the development. Is that fine? So what we have done so far, let me just summarize again. We have developed an API. If I have to write here, APIs are there. That APIs will receive request from our React application. Upon request, this API responsible is to take the request and response back to the client. Based on whatever request coming from the React application, I have to cater that. To process that request, I can make use of other layers. And since we have already discussed what is service layer, what is DAO or persistence layer. So based on the request from the React application, I am going to process the request. Sometimes based on the request, I may have to process in a way that I just have to invoke the service method, pass the student object, from there making use of DO layer, storing the data into the database. Fine. So based on whatever is the request, that service method I have to invoke. In the service method, in the service layer, in the business layer, we have to cater, we have to develop the logic which can give facility for all the requirement of the application. Fine. So in the controller, you should not be writing the logic to connect to the database or to perform the operation to store the data, retrieve the data. No, you just make the arrangement here, which should have a capability to receive the request and response back to the client. Fine. By chance, if the React application is giving you JSON data, you should have facility to receive that JSON data, convert that to Java object and give it to service layer. Service layer, by making use of persistence layer, will store the data into the database. Whatever response the service layer, based on the operation of business logic it has been implemented, the response will be given to the API, and based on the response received from the business logic from the service layer, that response will be given back to the React application. So that API development we have done, and two APIs we could able to invoke the service layer, and we could able to take the services. Now in the service layer, actual logic also has to be developed, which can make use of persistence layer and perform the DB related operation. I hope the control flow, especially the one who are also part of our class in the last class and last to last class, you are able to connect the dots directly. If someone is there in the class, how much ever you have understood, that's more than sufficient. And also those who are attending from the past 2-3 sessions, you also need not to worry much on the syntax, just to see the control flow and the approach of development which we are following here, how easily you can develop that approach. Syntax, since you are new to the world of Java or Spring Boot, by chance some of the terms might be difficult. That may happen with anyone if you are new to the world of any programming language in that case. Fine. But I hope the control flow is clear to everyone. So now we could able to develop the APIs. Two APIs. We are making use of the logic which is available in the service layer. We just have to again write some more business logics here and cater these two APIs also, these two remaining APIs also. And then in the service layer, we have to make use of, by making use of the persistence logic here, we have to perform the DB related operations. That is what we need to see in the upcoming sessions. Fine. So that's all for today. We have seen the session 3, the part 3 of the Spring Boot Java project development, and I hope you could able to connect your dots if you are part of these sessions continuously. Remaining things you will see in the upcoming sessions. Thank you so much for being with me in today's class. Again, we will see and we will meet in the next session, which will be in the day after tomorrow. Every alternate day we have these sessions. Thank you so much everyone again.